Hello, Bravs. We're back, this time with another ghost story from The Stately Ghosts of England by Diana Norman. Never mind the glare, there's a mylar jacket on there. Alright, none more of this bullshit. Chapter 6, Camfield Place and Buriton Manor. Tom Corbett is an ardent animal lover. His home just off Sloane Square is overrun by 2 dogs and at least 3 cats. The ill treatment of animals is one of the few subjects that will make him very angry. He maintains not only are animals intelligent, they are also tuned in better to psychic vibrations than human beings. He has seen his own boxer bitch, Biddy, back away with her hackles up from the unseen influence of a haunted room. He has always said that animals, dogs especially, have as much right to haunt as men and women. And do. They are individuals, aren't they, he asked, so they can become ghosts, although it's very rare for them to do so. There are records of animal ghosts in Britain, usually horses which seem to do a lot of galloping around with headless riders on their backs. But probably the most valuable account of an animal haunting came, again, from Robert Graves. It is, again, contained in his autobiography, Goodbye to All That. The incident occurred when he was on leave from France during the 1914 to 18 war. Isn't that World War I? Nancy, his wife's brother, Tony, had also gone to France by now, and her mother made herself ill by worrying about him. Early in June, he should be due to leave. I was on leave myself at the end of one of the 4 months cadet courses, staying with the rest of Nancy's family at Macy in the Road, Neward, a big Tudor house near Harlech. This was the most haunted house that I have ever been in, though the ghosts, with one exception, were not visible, except occasionally in the mirrors. They would open and shut doors, rap on the oak panels, knock the shades off lamps, and drink the wine from the glasses at our elbows when we were not looking. The house belonged to an officer in the 2nd Battalion, whose ancestors had most of them died of drink. The visible ghost was a little yellow dog that would appear on the lawn in the early morning to announce deaths. Nancy saw it through the window that time. The first Spanish influenza epidemic began, and Nancy's mother caught it, but did not want to miss Tony's leave and going to the London theaters with him. So when the doctor came, she took quantities of aspirin, reduced her temperature, and pretended to be all right. But she knew that the ghosts in the mirrors knew the truth. She died in London on July 13th, a few days later. Her chief solace as she lay dying was that Tony had got his leave prolonged on her account. Tony was killed in September. When Tom Corbett heard that Barbara Cartland, the romantic novelist and mother of Lady Lewisham, was haunted by the spirit of a dog, nothing could stop him making appearances to visit her house right away. Miss Cartland's belief in the supernatural being quite as strong as his own, she said she would be delighted to receive him at Camfield Place, her home at Essendon, in Hertfordshire. The Camfield Place estate has been in existence since the 15th century. But in 1867, the lovely Tudor house that stood on a hill overlooking its 500 acres was pulled down by an unimaginative Victorian, and a comfortable rambling, but much less picturesque mansion was built in its place. Probably its greatest claim to fame is that Beatrix Potter, creator of the immortal Peter Rabbit, spent most of her life there. In fact, the tale of Peter Rabbit, which has delighted generations of children, was conceived and written in and around the potting shed of Camfield's lovely garden. Indeed, the unimaginative Victorian was Miss Potter's grandfather. From the vantage point of the house, you can overlook a valley and the rise beyond it, along which there is an all but invisible road where, it is claimed, the young Elizabeth I used to ride during her days at Hatfield House, not far away. In 1950, Barbara Cartland, in real life Mrs. Hugh McCorquodale, moved in with her husband, her 2 sons, and her dogs. Like Tom Corbett, Miss Cartland never really feels at home unless there are at least 2 dogs at her heels. Before she actually took possession of the house, Miss Cartland followed the policy she has pursued at the other houses she has lived in, of having Camfield Place blessed by a priest. We always do that, she told me. I find it often saves a lot of trouble from ghosts. In the case of Camfield Place, there was just cause. There was just cause. Beatrix Potter has said that when she was very young and was sitting one evening in the huge lounge there, which was lit by 12 candles, she suddenly felt cold. Then, for no apparent reason, the candles began to go out, one after the other, as if an unseen hand was snuffing out the flames. However, whatever it was, has either faded away or was sent out of the house by the priest's blessing, for nothing quite as eerie as that has troubled the McCorkdales family since they came. Their ghost is much more mundane. Miss Cartland's belief is the supernatural stems from when she was a young girl and went on a holiday to Corinthia with her elder brother Ronald. While they were there, they saw what was undoubtedly a ghost building. The first time I, for one, had ever heard of such a phenomenon. We went for a walk one day through that lovely, lonely countryside, said Miss Cartland, and found ourselves walking beside a big lake. On the opposite bank, we both saw quite clearly one of those magnificent storybook castles, complete with spires and turrets that seemed to abound in that part of the world. When we got back to the village where we were staying, we described it and the lake and asked whom it belonged to. The villagers looked at us in amazement and told us that the castle had been destroyed many, many years before, and it was in complete ruin. They said that what remained of it didn't stand higher than 6 foot in any part. It was Barbara who urged her mother, Mrs. Polly Cartland, to consult the famous medium, Estella Roberts, during the Black Days in 1940, when the British expeditionary force had been overrun in France. Among the many who were reported missing at the time were Mrs. Cartland's 2 sons, Ronald and Tony. After an agonizing wait, the news came through that Ronald had been killed on May 30th. 20 miles from Cassel, but by the summer of 1941, there was still no news of Tony. Mrs. Cartland allowed herself to be persuaded to see Estelle Roberts at her home in Esher. Estelle told Mrs. Cartland that both her sons were dead, and that she was in touch with them both. The youngest one tells me that he was killed the day before his brother, she said. But Mrs. Cartland, who had made herself believe that Tony was a prisoner, refused to listen and left. On February 7th, 1942, 2 years after he was reported missing, the news finally came through that Tony had been killed fighting a rearguard action north of Ypres on May 29th, 1940, the day before Ronald's death. So you see, said Miss Cartland. I thought she was married. I am thoroughly convinced about spiritual and supernatural matters. If there was anything virulent about this house, it went with the blessing. The ghost we have now has moved in since we came. It happened this way. My younger son Glenn used to have a brown and white cocker spaniel whom he adored, although it was rather acrimonious, called Jimmy. Something went wrong with the glands around Jimmy's throat, and in 1955 we had to have him put down. I always have my doggies put to sleep here in the hall while I sit with them, so that they won't be so afraid, and that is what happened to Jimmy. Well, soon after that I began to notice something wrong with the other dogs at feeding time. Our dogs always feed with us in the dining room. Their food is put down for them on either side of the double doors. We noticed that they became jumpy when they were eating and would eye something that wasn't there and bark and growl at it. Murray, our black and white spaniel, was particularly jumpy. He began to back away from the food as if something was threatening him. Sometimes he would jump into the air and scream as if he was being attacked. Then, quite recently, we have begun to see Jimmy around the place. Only the other day I went into the hall where he was put to sleep, carrying flowers in my arms. As I went up to the hall table to arrange them in a vase, I saw that a dog was lying under it. It registered on my mind that the dog was brown and white, but I didn't realize it until later. I thought it was Murray and put out my foot to nudge him out of the way. I was amazed to find that my foot didn't touch anything. And when I looked down, there was nothing there. not a dog to be seen. Then I realized that I had seen a brown and white dog, not black and white like Murray is, and that it must have been Jimmy. Miss Cartland's maid, Miss Rose Purcell, has also seen Jimmy, who, during his lifetime, was an old friend of hers whom she often took on walks. It was about 2 years ago, and I was coming into the dining room. Just inside the door, lying curled up on the floor, was a brown and white dog, she said. It was where Jimmy always used to lie in the wintertime, and it seemed so natural that I hardly thought anything of it and picked up my foot to step over him. Then I realized and looked down, but he had disappeared. Since then, the harrying of the other dogs at meal times has grown worse. It's becoming a bore, said Miss Cartland. Our meals are interrupted by the squeals of pain from the dogs, and sudden jumps as they battle with this ghost for their food. Only the other evening, when we had people in for supper, we were continually disturbed by the growls and one-sided fights. Murray is getting more and more scared by it. For once in his life, Tom Corbett was at a loss. He was perfectly prepared to believe that the dog's ghost was haunting Camfield Place, but he was totally unable to tune into it, to his great disappointment. Having come to know Tom as well as I did, I knew that something else was on his mind, besides his inability to trace the ghost of an acrimonious spaniel. After lunch and at the end of a delightful, if fruitless, visit, Miss Cartland showed us to her Victorian door. During the thanks and goodbyes and general chit-chat that took place there, she happened to mention that her younger son Glenn was on a motoring tour of Europe. I saw Tom's ears prick up. Will you please tell him to be careful, he asked Miss Cartland. I think it's important. A bewildered and worried Miss Cartland said she would, and we drove away. In the car, Tom Corbett said to me, There's a car crash in the offing for that family. A young man is involved. I hope they'll be all right, and that she warns her son. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I heard from Miss Cartland what had happened. Her belief that clairvoyants can get glimpses of the future, combined with her belief in Tom Corbett as a trustworthy clairvoyant, made her extremely worried. Barbara Cartland fought with her doubts for an hour or two after we had left, and then put through a phone call to Glenn McQuarkadale in Brussels. When he came on the phone, she begged him to take care when he was driving. He promised that he would. While she was phoning, the McQuarkadale's young manservant was taking the car out of the Camfield Place garage to run down to Essendon, the nearby village. On his way back, he was involved in the crash and ended up with the car in a ditch. He escaped unhurt. The car was a complete write-off. Since Camfield Place is a private house, it is not inappropriate to include in the same chapter an account of the only other visit we made to a private house. This is Buriton Manor at Buriton, the first or last village in Hampshire, from the Sussex border, nestling under the Downs. The name of the village is pronounced as it is often spelled, Buriton. But in the Domesday Book, it figures under the name of Maple Dresham. The original manor was given to Queen Matilda by William the Conqueror, but that is long gone, and in its place stands a quiet, warm brick house with a plain Georgian face surrounded by green lawn. In 1719, it was bought by the grandfather of Edward Gibbon, the historian. The great man himself lived there, although he didn't make its acquaintance till after his first term in Oxford in 1752. Later, he was to spend most of his summers at Buriton, and although no part of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire was actually written at the manor, a great deal of his preparatory reading was done there. However, its great interest... So did that say it's often spelled Buriton? Okay. However, its great interest for Tom Corbett and myself arose from articles that appeared in nearly all the English national daily papers in 1957, which said that the then owner, Lieutenant Colonel Algernon Bonham Carter, had applied to Petersfield Rural District Council, his local authority, for a reduction in the rates he had to pay on the house because the manor was haunted. What is more, according to the newspaper reports of that time, the council had accepted his plea and reduced the rates accordingly by £13 a year. If this was in fact correct, it showed the rural district council in a light that was both unusual and charming for a local authority. But although I have made inquiries, the Petersfield RDC displays a curious reluctance to reveal the details of the meeting and reduce the manor's rates. And I am very little wiser about the whole business now than I was when I began. However, the young people who took over the house after the death of Lieutenant Colonel Bonham Carter, Mr. and Mrs. Miller Sterling, said that as far as they knew, the newspapers were correct and that the manor's rates were reduced on the grounds that a ghost deducted from its value. There is no doubt, Mr. Miller Sterling told us when he went to see him, that Lieutenant Colonel Bonham Carter was very psychic and that the house was extremely haunted during his time. He and his wife led us out of their low-ceilinged lounge to the Georgian front door to show us the huge, graceful tithe barn, which stands across the lawn facing the house. The tradition goes that a woman servant, a chambermaid, hanged herself in that barn many, many years ago. Apparently, you could hear her going out of the house across to the barn, as she did that last time in her life. I believe that the colonel saw her more than once. We went back into the house again. There is an underground passage that used to lead to the church, which is just outside the grounds, and which was still the chapel belonging to the manor until 1886. The colonel's butler used to say that he could often hear footsteps walking along the passage towards the church. Either the Miller Sterlings are not psychic, or the ghosts that so disturbed Lieutenant Colonel Bonham Carter have gone, and the house once more stands quiet amid the beautiful Hampshire countryside. But a ripple of the past ran through it some years ago, when their 5-year-old son complained that someone keeps trying to take my pillow away at night when I'm in bed. The boy slept in a small, uneven floored bedroom in the oldest part of the house. Guests who have been put there when the other 11 bedrooms in the house are full have complained to Mr. and Mrs. Miller Sterling that their sleep was disturbed by weird dreams. So naturally enough, they asked Tom Corbett if he would have a look at it. The room opens off a little passageway and overlooks the tree-shaded lawn at the back of the house. Tom stood in the center of it for a moment or two, and then went out into and down the passage until he stopped outside a room on the left. The ghost goes into your son's room, he told Mrs. Miller Sterling. These hyphenated names are killing me. And comes down this passage to this room. It is quite distinct. It is an elderly, somehow warm-natured woman. She has the appearance of a nanny to me. She doesn't try to take away your son's pillow. She's soothing it to make him more comfortable. There's nothing to worry about. She wouldn't hurt him. There was no connection between this comfortable person and the suicide, Tom told us, to the relief of Mr. and Mrs. Miller Sterling. In fact, it was the only ghost Tom could find in the whole house. He could not pick up the traces of the hanged maid, nor hear the footsteps trudging along the secret passage to the church. However, there is some confusion about the ghost that Lieutenant Colonel Bonham Carter saw. The Miller Sterlings say it was the hanged maid, but when I rang up the colonel's brother, Admiral Sir Stuart Bonham Carter, who lived in the nearby town of Petersfield, he told me that the ghost at Buriton Manor had been a dear little old lady, which does not sound very much like the apparition of a maid about to commit suicide. In fact, it sounds a great deal more like the comforting nanny that Tom Corbett described. Tom's particular gifts have thrown him into a profession where it is almost impossible to be proved right beyond doubt. It is to his eternal credit that throughout all the visits we made, any new evidence that turned up and about which he could not possibly have known consistently dovetailed in with his stated findings. Although I never doubted him, I have never got over being surprised at each new display of his incredible insight. In the case of Buriton Manor, the evidence was too nebulous to prove anything to anybody. However, coming as it did directly after our experience at Camfield Place, when he saw a young man connected with the household involved in a car crash some 6 hours before it happened, I have absolutely no doubt that a nanny is haunting Buriton Manor. Taking it taking care of the children as she did in life, and as Tom Corbett says she is. All right, Bobs, that's all. Goodbye. Goodbye.